Grace to you all and peace in the name of the God who is, who was, and who is to come. And welcome to this time with Chris Doyle, a member of our presbytery who has done extensive research and is kindly sharing it with all of us tonight. For those of you, let's open with prayer. Loving God, you bless us by calling us into your world, and in changing us, we become instruments of peace and change in that world. We thank you for the experiences that Chris has had and that he now shares. And we pray that we might have hearts that are open to the ways in which your Spirit is touching us, changing us, all to your glory. It's in your Son's name that we pray this. Amen.
Amen.
For those of you who don't know Chris, and even those of you who do, there's a lot to know about him. Our speaker is Chris Doyle, who was born and raised in upstate New York in the Roman Catholic tradition. He worked and studied in Israel, Kenya, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Italy before entering a graduate program in Holocaust studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel. That led to living in the West Bank town of Bethlehem and teaching in the local Christian school system. In turn, that led to working with refugees and in refugee ministry, and to a position with the Presbyterian Church USA's Hunger Program. With the Hunger Program, Chris worked with development programs in Iraq, Jordan, the West Bank, and Egypt. In 1994, Chris met Hala, and they were married in May of 1995 and began their family, having two sons, Nadim and Adib. Returning to the United States in 2005 and attending the University of Dubuque's Theological Seminary, Chris graduated in 2009 and began his formal parish ministry in the Presbyterian Church in South Jersey before coming to North Jersey and serving the Oak Ridge and Berkshire Valley Presbyterian churches. As if that were not busy enough, in the midst of all of that, Chris also completed his Doctor of Ministry degree through University of Dubuque Theological Seminary, focusing on Generation X and what the church needs to do to re-engage with that generation, which he believes could and should be a major focus in rejuvenating the church. Chris comes to us as a member of the church development team, and it's from that team that he offered and the team invited him to speak to the presbytery. And that's just one of the ways in which your per capita funds contribute to the greater work of the presbytery by allowing teams like church development. Chris, thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you for your sharing tonight.
Well, thank you very much, first and foremost, to you, Steve, and to everyone at the Presbytery for giving me this chance to share about my research and my work. It's very exciting for me, and Steve said, I do very much believe that it could and should be a major focus of ministry for the Presbyterian Church and for all churches, really. But I'd like to start this evening first by having us all realize a little something about the Presbyterian Church that maybe we don't realize or not, but that about 65%, a little bit over that, of the church membership are either silent generation or baby boomer folk, and mainly being baby boomer folk because silent generations now are passing from us. And that leaves about 14% of the church membership at PCUSA being Generation X, which is my generation, and then about 21% being millennials. And so we are the lowest percentage of membership in the church. I will just give you a brief idea about the generations and how they break down, in that silent generation folks are generally from the late 20s, mid to late 20s until the very early 1940s, really until the end of World War II, sorry. And then the boomer generation really kind of picks up from 1946 and ends in around 1962. And the reason why I say 1962, and I know that that seems early for some people, but that's when the birth control pill was introduced to the US for public consumption. And so suddenly birth rates started to fall because of that, and then enter in Generation X. And we go until late 70s, we'll say. And then we get into millennials from the 1980s onward. And so 14% of us are part of the PCUSA. And there are 65 million of us in the United States. And so that kind of gives you this idea of a church membership of about 1.1 million today, with only about 14% of those being in the Generation X cohort, 21% millennial, and the rest all boomer and silent generation. And so the big question is, what is going to happen to our church in the next 10 years when those baby boomers and silent generation folk are either not with us anymore or just simply unable to do the work that they are all doing today? And so that is a really, really big problem that we all have to kind of think about, I think, as a church, and how we're going to address it. I'd like to share with you a couple paragraphs from one of the chapters in my dissertation that's now, it's now published. And I wrote, due to the influences of a social opening up of society in the 1960s and 1970s, and after the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Generation X, especially in the Northeast of the US, came to see the damage that systematic prejudices in the United States have caused to themselves, their family, their friends, and acquaintances. As a result, they became less tolerant of such views and even began to value diversity and celebrate it, and began asking en masse if the teachings of Jesus Christ were being honestly practiced in the churches of their youth. The answer they often came to was a resounding no. They saw the hypocrisy, and when included with everything else they were exposed to and experiencing, they left their church instead of working to be change agents. Some migrated to other traditions or new ones where they found less hypocrisy and more diversity, but most left entirely. Through the interview process and surveying for this study, and being greatly in line with the perceptions of the reformers of 500 years ago in Europe, the general perception Generation X has developed of the church was found to be a need to reform to the original precepts of the church. Generation X ended up becoming very much educated about the church and about history and how that kind of, all came about, and then decided, I don't really want to be a part of this. Now, inside of all of that, we have to realize that about 90% of Gen Xers in the Northeast and across the country in general were raised in the church. If think about the 1970s and VBS schools or Sunday schools, they were generally loaded with a lot of kids, and that was the kids of my generation. I can honestly tell you that growing up, I did not know anyone that I was in school with who was not involved with or a member of some church, whatever that church might be. And so about 90% of this generation has grown up in the church, at least to some extent, with about 69% of those people saying that they were strongly influenced as a child in the church. And so we have to ask, where did they go and why? And why is it that only a percentage in the teens is really involved in any church form? And this goes across the board for Catholic Church as well as mainline denominations. And so in thinking about that specifically, we have to really consider the perceptions that Generation X cohort folk would have of the church. And we can say pretty solidly that most of them really became pretty negative during their teenage years due to seeing people they thought were being hypocritical, not really standing up and not really representing what it was that Christ had been teaching. And so learning about all of the history, having their own experience of seeing people who were sitting in the pews around them appearing as hypocritical to them. And then also during this time, we were incredibly affected. There were massive changes happening during this time coming out of the 60s and 70s. When entering into the 80s, you suddenly have technology taking off like it had never taken off before. I say in the book that when I was growing up, we had 4 television stations. We had ABC, CBS, NBC, and PBS. And then when I was in the 6th grade, we got cable in the early 80s, and everyone started just having this entire new world opened up to them. Then enter into that computers and video games and all of these things that were completely brand new. And it really changed how we were going to look at the world and how we were going to judge the world and how we were going to see ourselves as a part of that world. And so we also grew up at that time during the highest rate of divorce in the United States. 1981, there was a 60% divorce rate. So a lot of the boomer parents who had gotten married when they were 19, 20, 18, 21, in this early age range that had been the norm at that point in time, were suddenly divorcing by the early 1980s. And so 40% of Generation X kids ended up becoming latchkey kids. I myself, when I was about 13 years old, my mother left the house and went to work. This was for a couple different reasons. One, many women in the late 60s, mid-late 60s were starting to work, but then when they got married, they stayed home and took care of the kids. And so they wanted to go back to work once their kids were old enough for that. But then on top of that, in the 1970s, if you remember the 1970s, you'll remember that in the late 1970s, there was an incredible economic crisis that happened in this country. And so in order to pay the bills and deal with the economic reality that was hitting everybody, suddenly women had to go to work. It wasn't just a choice, but it became a great need. Now, mix on top of that globalization, and we have a whole other problem that's happening for this generation in that suddenly we went from Main Street to larger department stores and malls. That is in the 1980s is when the mall culture developed. And suddenly the small shops that, maybe we grew up going to, they went out of business and we had to go down to the mall or to a larger town that had what it was that we were looking for and all the things that we were looking for. Suddenly we had this incredible different array of things that were being cheaply made in mainly China and Asian countries and coming into our country at a much, much cheaper price because suddenly companies were being, under the Reagan administration, companies were being almost encouraged to move outside of the country because they knew that they would be able to get cheaper wages in their workers and therefore higher profits. And so that was encouraged at that point in time. And it created this plethora of stuff for us as a country that we had never been exposed to before, okay? When I was a student studying in Africa, I was there for 8 months and came back, and I went literally from the airport and we had to stop at the grocery store. And I walked into the grocery store and I was stunned by the paper aisle. Only in the United States can you walk into a supermarket and have an entire aisle of that store devoted to paper goods, paper plates, tissues, paper towels, toilet paper, and then all of the other things, plastic bags and things like this that go along with that aisle. And I remember just standing there and staring at this aisle and thinking to myself, what is wrong with this picture? But this is how we developed, especially in the 1980s, with an incredible amount of stuff put in front of us. And that affected us, desperately affected us, because in some ways we kind of became a little spoiled by all of that. Then there was something else. In the 1980s, we had the development of the moral majority. In the 1960s and 70s, you started having some folks who were going out being evangelists and then getting on television and having very popular television shows. And then in the 1980s, you had the development of the moral majority, which then put itself into politics as well. And so you have these incredible business-minded evangelicals who are going out, who are raising incredible amounts of money to do the ministry that they are speaking about and involving themselves into politics. Remember, Pat Robertson ran for president in the 1980s. And then there were a massive amount of scandals. I'm sure all of us remember Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and their air-conditioned doghouse and everything that came out on top of that, as well as scandals with Oral Roberts and Jimmy Swaggart and Jerry Falwell. All of these guys ended up having these massive scandals. And those scandals and that evangelism was kind of defining for us who and what the church was, because it was so much in our face. And so we're seeing all of this take place in the church in front of us. We don't feel that we're necessarily having our needs addressed in the church, because it was basically being run by our grandparents, and our grandparents didn't really see the import in teenage views. And then we're seeing the scandals, we're seeing the economic realities, we're seeing ourselves being thrust into a system of education that was not really what we needed in a big way. And so much of our generation kind of saw all of this together and thought, we need to be doing something very, very different. And part of that doing something very, very different meant walking away from the church, because it wasn't representing what we thought we believed in or did believe in, and perhaps still do. And the society that we were living in was certainly not helping us to try and develop in a way that would be more Christian reared and focused on doing what is good in our society and in our community so much. We did end up becoming a very self-focused society at that time. Then I'd throw on top of that the sex scandals of the 1990s. And that kind of sealed the deal for a lot of us, because we said, you know what, we don't want to be involved with this anymore. And so we went out trying to look and find our own ways. Now, perhaps fortunately or unfortunately for the church and for many people, in the 1970s and 1980s, in part because of the technology that we're being introduced to, we ended up also being introduced to a lot of other ways of belief, whether they be Hindu or Buddhist or New Age, which was very popular in the 1980s, or finding other things that really kind of excited us and made us feel welcomed and drawn. And so we stepped away from the church for that reason as well, because we were finding other ways of thinking and believing. In the surveying that I did for this project, about half of the people who were surveyed declared that, yes, they think that reincarnation is a great possibility. And this is something that comes from Eastern religions. It's not from Christianity at all. But that's just one example of how our society was being affected by outside influences that were coming into the United States from almost every single direction. Add on top of that diversity, and suddenly you have the perfect storm for an entire generation to walk away from the church, not seeing it as viable, not seeing it as important to their lives or worth really anything to our lives. And so we walked away. Now, I think it's also important to say that there was an expectation on top of my generation to return to the church once we had kids. That was famously kind of the idea put forth by our parents and grandparents. You know, I remember speaking to my grandfather, who was the sexton at the church, and saying, I'm not really interested in being in the church. And he said, well, you'll change when you have kids, you'll come back to the church. And I think that that was a pretty big assumption made by a lot of older folk, because perhaps they had done that as well. It didn't happen that way. We walked away from the church, and we essentially stayed away from the church. Now, the reasons obviously go much, much deeper than what I just kind of outlined, but I think it's important that we as the church really start to think broadly about this question and think about the different things that we can do that can really put a welcoming and inviting hand out to Generation X. Generation X, as I said, 90% of them were raised in the church, and about 90% of them believe that there is a God, and they believe in the Christian form of God. Okay, it's about 70% that truly believe in the Christian form of God. They just don't trust the church and don't want to be a part of the church because of their past experiences. So that means that the church really has a lot of work to do in front of us. And one of the biggest things, and this is coming from interviewing and from surveying people about what they think the church needs to do. The first thing that the church needs to do is to work at understanding why Generation X left the church to begin with. What was going on at that time? If you have an understanding of the situation that developed and why it developed and how, then we will be much better equipped to be able to engage with Generation X and have understanding conversations where we can really kind of see each other on an equal basis. And that is going to be absolutely vital. But if we don't do that background learning about what all took place to make Generation X the way they are, that conversation is never going to have a chance to really get started, I'm afraid. I think it's important for churches and for presbyteries, as well as the national church, to really develop programs of like Generation X task force, where Generation X task forces will go out and really try to speak to people from Generation X to see what it is that they think the church should be doing. Oftentimes, our churches can engage with people when people feel that the church is doing something that is important to them. And churches are doing lots and lots of important things, but they're not necessarily things that are important to Generation X. And that will change from community to community. Sometimes Generation Xers will be very concerned about the schools or about property rates or about health insurance or about all different types of things. If the churches can find out what those subjects are that really matter to the Generation X folk in their area, they'll be better able to reach out to them, because then they can design programs that would be specifically geared toward them. And that is an essential thing that I think the church has to do really across the board. The other thing that I think we really need to do is we need to teach our congregations what it is that we're doing that's positive. Okay, the reputation and the idea that so many have of the church is, oh, they've got lots of money, they don't need money. And they also think, well, you know, they don't really care about the poor. Maybe they give them some food or something like that, but what are they really doing for the poor? Or about international. I worked in international missions for several years. And the one thing that I learned that struck me the most is that people in the United States, generally speaking, do not have a clue as to what it is that the church is doing overseas and overseas missions, as well as in missions right here in our own country. I think it's really, really essential that we really start teaching about what it is that the church is doing that is positive, because those stories help to let other people in our own pews and beyond understand what it is that we're doing that folks could find exciting and really wanting to get involved in it. Okay, the church does incredible ministries with refugees, with the poor, in education, in healthcare, in all different types of areas. The Presbyterian Church, and specifically I'm speaking about, but it really is across the board with many churches, are doing an incredible amount of work. In my years overseas, I saw and understood that the majority of development work and aid work that happens across the world is being done by churches and church organizations. That sounds perhaps incredible, because we think that our governments and the United Nations are doing all of this work, but generally speaking, they're doing a very small percentage of it. It is very much on the shoulders of the churches who are doing this work, but we don't know about it. And so if we get that word out about all of that, I think that will be much, much better to be able to then answer those questions that come from our neighbors and our friends who may be hesitant to come to the church. And you can say, these are the things that our church is doing, when that person says, well, what is it that the church really does? If we're prepared to give those answers that people really need to hear, I think that we'll be setting ourselves up for a much better future. And then we also need to teach community. I know that churches oftentimes are assumed to be these wonderful places that just inspire and grow community in a loving way, because that's what churches are supposed to do, apparently. The problem is that we all know that that's not always the case. Churches generally always describe themselves as friendly, as loving, as caring, as open. But the reality is that they oftentimes aren't. churches are reflections of the people that make them up. And if we as church leaders are not out there actually teaching community and what community is supposed to be looking like and what community can do when it's allowed to do, then we're basically fighting against ourselves. Okay. We oftentimes will talk about the missions that we do and all of these other little local projects and things that we do, and that's marvelous. Okay. But if we don't start teaching community in our pews and using scripture and the gospel story, which is our best source to do exactly that, we're kind of dead in the water, because nobody wants to walk into a church that doesn't seem nice and friendly and opening and warm and inviting. The churches have a lot to do, I think, to make those words in our mission statements a reality. And then the big thing that a lot of people were talking about, and this is the last one, is about leadership. The churches, depending on the denomination that you go to, will have a really varied level of training for their ministers. I am proud to say that the Presbyterian Church is a church that takes the training of its ministers very, very seriously, but not all churches do. And all churches end up getting tossed into the same pot. So leadership is absolutely key, whether it be about preaching a message that is connecting with people, that is teaching people, and having people walk out of the sanctuary on Sunday mornings saying, oh, wow, I learned something today. I understood what the message was about, and have it be a celebration. Okay, we need to work at really developing our leadership in a way that they will be able to then go out and really do the ministry of the church in a way that does inspire people and makes people leave on Sunday morning saying, I can't wait to come back on next Sunday. And so that's also really, really important. There was an article in a Christianity Today, I believe, that just came out last week. And the title was Gen Z Wants Honesty in Its Church Leadership. The first reaction that I have is, don't we all want to have honesty in our church leadership? But that is a subject that they are targeting on Gen Z, but Generation X is right there with them too. They don't want to hear about ministers maybe being manipulative or lying about something or giving false information about something. It's extremely important that the church leadership that we have in place is going to be able to address the issues that people have and to do it in a way that is loving and kind and truly Christ-like. That's a challenge, an amazing challenge for the church leadership. But we tend to either go all the way in with church projects and community outreach or academia, and there needs to be a mix of the two in order to really have leadership become something that is inspiring for people. That's what I have as far as kind of trying to give you the project in a nutshell. If there are any questions, we can certainly have some interesting conversation, I'm sure.
You can ask your question by raising your hand or simply at this point unmuting and asking, or you can put it in the chat. Courtney?
Hi, thank you for being here with us. My role at the church is a director of Christian education. So I am focused heavily on Gen X's kids. And of course, we've had a lot of Gen Xers who were involved in our church. And then after COVID, they have not returned yet. And I was wondering if there's any insight into the best approach to reach out to Gen Xers who were present in our specific congregation, but have kind of fallen off the wayside.
Yeah, actively invite them. You know, I mean, Gen Xers are very much a group that needs to be reached out to, because I think that the generation has felt that the church has done a great job at ignoring them. You know, one of the issues that came up a lot in interviewing and surveying for this and in other research is that the churches generally skip Generation X. The church was being, led by silent generation folk, and then it moved into boomer leadership. And the boomer leadership, my parents, kind of felt that we were a bit of a lost cause because we were telling our parents, I'm not going back to church. What are you, crazy? And so we ended up getting skipped over. And so our parents who were leading and running the churches more often than not said, well, at least I can try to get my grandchildren. And so the church really focused in on generation, the millennials and Gen Z now, and trying to get those kids back into church. But they didn't have that same attitude when we were young. And so we often have felt ignored by the church. And so my advice for that is actively invite them, not just sending a letter in the mail saying, oh, we'd love to see you on Sunday, but give them a phone call, reach out, really reach out and engage with them and try to have conversation. I really believe that, it would be very beneficial to try and have, a type of celebration of really inviting everybody back to church. We're just coming out of COVID. There are still lots of folks that are apprehensive of coming into crowds and into groups of people. And so have a celebration, celebrate the church, celebrate a rejuvenation of the church, and actively invite those people back in. And I think that they will more than most likely respond pretty positively to that. But you have to actively invite and not just send a letter home with the kid when he's going home from Sunday school.
Now, in response to that, I'm a millennial, and so talking on the phone is not what millennials like to do. So I'm going to have to stretch myself to reach out to another generation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Keep in mind, when I was a teenager, the biggest problem in our house was fighting over the phone. And I think that that's probably the case for most Gen Xers, was fighting over the phone. And so we're very familiar and comfortable with the phone. It took me quite a while to get a cell phone because I don't want to carry around a cell phone. Let somebody call me on a real phone. So I think a lot of us still have those attitudes.
Thank you.
Chris, Kim asks about study leave options to learn more. Do you have any suggestions?
I think that this is a hard one because, in all honesty, there is right now in the last year, lots of stuff being written about this subject. When I started this project, there was literally nothing. I called PCUSA, I called the church center in Louisville, and when I got a hold of somebody, I asked if there was someone in the research department that I could speak to that deals with statistics and outreach for Generation X and perhaps millennials. And I was told, well, we have someone for millennials, but we don't have anyone for Generation X. Would you like to speak to him? And I said, okay, yeah, sure, I'll speak to him. So I spoke to him, and my first question to him was, and he was born in 1970, he was a Gen Xer like myself. And I asked him, what is it that the church is doing to reach out to Generation X? And he started laughing, and he said, absolutely nothing. And so, study options, I don't know if you're really good at independent study. There's starting to be stuff out there that you can learn from, but specifically for Generation X, there's very, very little to really get into. And there's a question here, so how do we develop our skills? Well, I think that the first thing to develop the skills is to really start having those conversations. Having roundtable conversations and brainstorming is marvelous, but you need to do it in person also. I was on a meeting just last night where it was me and 5 other people. We were trying to do some brainstorming, and we eventually got there. But the virtual format isn't really helpful for that. We need to have sit-down roundtable discussions where we talk about these things specifically. not trying to push my book, but I think that my book can help in that, because inside of that, I do put where the last chapter of the book is talking about what the churches can do. And then after each suggestion, I put pointed conversation starter questions that can kind of help in getting those conversations started. And so that is going to be the first absolute place to start. If we don't understand what it is that Generation X kind of went through and deals with, then we're not going to get very far. And so the first place to start is with those conversations, and conversations with your own Gen Xers, because there's usually maybe one or two in a church.
Does anyone else have any questions for Chris? Chris, thank you for
Yeah.
tonight. Oh, wait,
Oh.
someone jumping in?
Yes.
Yes, please.
My name is Maisie Hodgson, and thank you very much, Chris. I was very interested in this topic because we're really struggling. Children, we have 2, 1 4, and maybe 1 12. And, how do we get the group back together, or how to keep them motivated? You said something before that you did mission work in Nicaragua. And I just wanted to find out what kind of mission work did you do there, because I'm from Nicaragua.
Okay, I wasn't doing mission work in Nicaragua. I was a student with my college there, and I was actually doing a study there about Iran-Contra.
Okay.
Yeah, so it wasn't a really happy subject, but that's what I was doing. That was back in 1991.
Okay.
When all of that was pretty hot right there.
Okay. Thank you. So
My
what's the
mission
title
work
of
was
your,
really more in the Middle East.
what's the title of the book?
The title of the book is Responding Faithfully to Generation X. There is a picture of it on the Presbytery website, and I believe there's information about how to get it. It's published by Westbow Press, which is it's a division of Zondervan in Michigan, and it can be gotten either through Westbow Press or on Amazon as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Courtney?
If I could just
please.
say, in regard to the book itself, and this is a copy of it right here. I think it probably comes out backwards, but the first chapter kind of really just gets into it talks about the Generation X experience and kind of defines generations and how we look at generations. And then the second chapter gets into specific examples of Generation X lives, and has the transcriptions of 5 interviews, or majorly transcribed interviews with 5 folks. And interestingly, all of them were raised in the church. 5 of them were raised in the church. Only 2 of them have anything to do with the church today. But then it also gets into the survey results and various things that folks were sharing in the surveys that I thought were really, really important for everyone to be able to hear. And then the third chapter gets into that even a little bit more deeply, getting into things that were going on in the 1970s and 80s that really affected the generation and led folks away from the church. And so it's really kind of a good starter book to kind of understand the Generation X story. And then the 4th chapter gets into really the biblical background of how this is nothing new. If we really seriously look at scripture, realize that our churches have been in far, far worse places than they are today. And so we can take a little bit of strength from that idea. But the 4th chapter really gets into looking at scripture and really plowing through specifically the book of Judges and Corinthians, and how this issue was addressed in the past and how we can then address it. And then the 5th chapter is one that really gets into the ideas and the focuses that we need to be working on and at in order to bring Generation X back into the church.
Thank you.
It's like Courtney has a question for you, Chris, a second
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
If I may, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I was thinking more about what you said about parents or the Gen X's leaving, and I was wondering if your research had brought to any conclusions about how then they are raising their kids or not raising their kids in a faith community. Because I know you had said there
Yeah.
was a lot of other things that they went to or that they looked for to fulfill that, spirituality. Is there any research about what they're doing with their kids now?
There is some research, but it is very scant. But generally speaking, they're not taking them to church. And I think that we all know that for pretty much a fact, because all of our churches are suffering from a real lack of children being a part of our congregations. But generally, they're not going anywhere, which makes them kind of ripe for the picking. Some of the Generation X, kind of lean toward Buddhism or lean toward, one tradition versus another, in really a search for what it was that they felt they were missing. But the far majority went nowhere and ended up really developing, their closer relationships instead of being inside of the church, developing their closer relationships with friends and with their workplace co-workers. And so they're missing, 70% of the survey results when asked, do you feel yourself spiritually hungry? 70% said yes. So Generation X, I believe, is really looking for and searching for, and they realize what it is that they're missing. But they don't know where to get that, because we as a church and as churches are really bad at inviting people in. There is this general idea out there, I think, in a lot of congregations that the minister should be bringing people into the church. But the reality is that as a congregation, it's everyone's duty to try and introduce and bring people into the church, just as much as it is then the job of the minister and the congregation to give people a reason to want to come back and be involved.
Right. Thank you.
There's a question, have you noticed a lot of Gen Xers joining in online worship, but reticent about coming? I didn't get the rest of it.
Into the building.
Into the building. I don't think that they are attending virtually so much. The wonderful thing about the internet, and I heard this over and over again, is, well, if I go online, I can watch a sermon from somebody who's maybe on the other side of the world, but it's a wonderful sermon and it inspires me and I'd love to listen to it. And okay, that's wonderful. But the problem is that they're not doing that in community.
Right.
And that's what the church is meant to be, is meant to be a community of people who come together around something bigger than themselves and want to learn and grow in their faith together with other people. It's those discussions that we have at coffee hour and other times that really form the community. And so, I don't think tons of people are going to the online version only, but they are just kind of just not doing anything and need to be invited / brought back into the church. And there's another one. Hi, Julie. It says, have you noticed a lot of Gen Xers? Oh, if that were the case, how would you reach out to them? Would it be scary to just call them on the phone? No, I don't think that it might be scary for the person that's doing the phone calling, but I don't think that, if you know of parents who maybe their kids are involved in the church, call them. Okay, call them up and have a conversation. If you meet people out and about in the community who, well, they don't have to be Gen Xers, but talk about your church, talk it up. You know, we as Presbyterians are not very good about talking about our faith tradition, about our church. And that is pretty detrimental to us as a church overall. I think that we have to be a lot braver about going out and speaking about what it is that we believe in with our families, with our friends, maybe with our neighbors, maybe with the person that you are standing behind in the grocery line. We have to be braver at doing that. Yeah, Tracy?
Yes, hi. You know, I purchased your book, and I'm looking forward to getting it and reading it. In my life, my grandparents were very involved with the church, and they tried very hard to bring their grandchildren in, but my parents stopped them. My baby boomer parents said, leave them alone. And so we went to church here and there. But I would have preferred to be outside on a beautiful day, playing baseball or something like that. But as I've gotten older, I've become so much more thirsty for an education. So I can't say that I ever had a really good religious education. And for me, who hasn't had much of an education, I find that sometimes the message at church is so safe, is almost too safe, that I'm not challenged by it. Everything is so nice and pleasant and welcoming. And I just, I like it. I mean, I certainly like people being nice to me and vice versa, but I leave with a sort of emptiness, like, well, I didn't really learn much. And I think that there's a lot of people in my Generation X that are as thirsty as I am. And it's either, my grandparents were taught the Old Testament God, and I'm taught the New Testament God. And I don't know. I might need a little bit of Old Testament God. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I do think that you need some Old Testament God, because I don't think that you can really understand the New Testament God unless you understand the Old Testament God. So I think that is important. But you know what, there's something that you're saying inside of all of that I think is, one, worth mentioning, but two, also very typical of the generation, in that you recognize your hunger. And so, your job for yourself is to find a place where you're going to be fed. Okay. And I think that that's what we all really end up having to do. I don't think that, I know what you're saying about, oh, it's all so nice. And I walk away feeling like I'm not being challenged. I get it. But I think that is a question that goes back to leadership. I think it goes back to how ministers are trained in the seminaries. I think it's personally, and I might get in trouble for this, but I think it's crazy that I had to have 6 semesters of Greek, but only 2 semesters of preaching. I think that the seminaries need to do a better job at certainly working with students to really be able to preach more effectively. And that's obviously a goal for, I think, probably every minister to really be able to preach effectively. But I understand, and I hear you when you say it's just all so nice. I think that we do need to be a little bit braver when it comes to putting things out in front of our congregations, even if they might rustle feathers a little bit sometimes.
I mean, is it so safe because we're afraid to lose more numbers of people?
Oh, there's certainly some that are like that. I think that all of the ministers would agree that, we can be apprehensive about how we're going to present something.
But yet it's interesting because you're talking about how people are going online on YouTube, listening to a sermon. I know I do that.
Sometimes, yeah.
And I get a lot out of it because, I mean, not that I have to be in the privacy of my own home, but sometimes taking in a message, some of it can be, offensive to others, and I just want to hear what people have to say, and so in that regard, it is nice to listen to an online sermon,
Sure.
Yeah.
I've listened to online sermons. There's some wonderful sermons out there. There's no doubt about that, but you're lacking the community. And the
Yes,
community is what
that's
the
right.
church is. And so, I mean, I'm not sure where you're going to church, but have a talk with your minister about this. I
Yes.
mean, I think that it's really possible that, ministers should be open, and I can guarantee you that ministers want to hear from their parishioners, especially when it comes to words about the message. As a minister on Sundays, we walk out to the front door as people are walking out, and most people would say, "Oh, well, that was a good sermon. Oh, I really enjoyed that sermon." Nobody ever stops and says, "Listen, I got some questions for you." Stop and question your minister.
Okay.
And
Thank
if you feel that your minister is not challenging you, I kind of suggest that you should challenge your minister.
All right. Thank you very much.
Chris, it looks like you've gotten an invitation to come and talk about old time religion. Kim
Old-time
Robbins.
religion.
And so
Okay.
Kim, you can find Chris's contact information in the Presbytery's directory, and feel free to reach out to him and see what you can do.
Can you hear me? I've just taken myself off mic. I want to make sure you can hear me though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, very good. Well, so there's a group of us sitting here from the First Presbyterian Church of Boonton, and we want to thank you very much for this. It was really powerful. As a Gen Xer, it resonates. But we also invite everybody on this call to our movie nights, because these kind of conversation where we talk about challenging and empty faith, and this is really powerful, like for the people stuff. So we encourage everybody to get together to have these deep and hard conversations. We try to do it with some of our leadership and members, and it's really amazing. Those are the really strong times, I think, for the church.
Sure.
That's all I had to say.
No,
Thank
you. For
And
sure.
you've gotten a thank you from Carrie Morgan as well.
Well, thank you, Carrie.
In a moment or two we have left, does anybody have any last questions for Chris?
Hey, Chris, one quick question. With so much happening online, at least for the millennial generation, do you feel Gen X can effectively be reached in an online format? You've talked a lot about basically reaching out to Gen X in terms of phone calls, in terms of in-person gatherings, and I agree, that's good stuff. My question is with kind of ministry online being what it is now, is that an appropriate format to reach out to Gen X in any way, shape, or form? Can a community grow in that sense, do you think?
I think that a community can grow in any sense, and if you find an effective avenue and that's a virtual one and it's working, go for it. What that is exactly, I don't know. I think it would take some time and some research to really look in to see what is out there as far as any Gen X groups that may exist that you could kind of plug into or at least take as a model. There are some, there's Gen X Presbyterians, and there's some of these groups that are out there connected to the church, but I think, you can have some discussions in those formats. And they do exist, but you're generally kind of singing to the choir almost with those. I think that, like I said, if you can figure out that some way to make a virtual program one that works, then go for it. But I don't have any idea specifically of exactly what that is. Gen X folks did tell me that they would like to have things online in the evening, because we're still working, generally speaking, more than full-time jobs. Maybe we're taking care of kids, maybe we're taking care of parents, maybe we're taking care of grandchildren. And so we have incredibly busy lives. And so it is important to try and figure out what might be of interest to Gen X. And if that can be in a virtual format, great, because I think that it could be inviting. How to reach those folks, though, I don't know. I think it could still be kind of word of mouth more than anything else, unless you were able to tap into a Gen X site that, would propose something that would really excite people. It says here, make TikToks. Everybody is addicted. I'm 53 years old and I have my kids showing me things on TikTok, and I'm not personally really that technologically advanced to make a TikTok. But if someone's willing to teach me, I'm willing to learn.
This is Kim again. So sorry I'm popping in here, but we're
Not at
the same
all.
age. And I have to say that my community of work people, friends, everybody who's kind of in my age group really use this as a way to do information, send information, whether it's something on, a senator speaking, or if it's a recipe. So it isn't just fun dances. It isn't, I know that's kind of what we think about first
Sure.
off, but there's a ton of great information, and, it just takes continually doing that same kind of message. And I think it's like when we talk about ways to reach people just in general, it might not just be a Gen X thing, but TikTok really does have legs, and it's, if they don't ban it, but say they
If
don't,
ban it. If they
yeah,
don't ban it.
then, it's a good platform for people to think about, because, as long as you have something meaningful to say and there's an audience for it, it will be found on TikTok.
Okay, I'll have to ask my kids further about it.
Chris, thank you for tonight. This has been very helpful. And if there are folks out there who would like to follow up with him, again, if you have access to the Presbytery's directory, or always call the Presbytery's office, and we can make sure the word gets to Chris of your interest. But thank you again, Chris. This has been a very
Thank you.
informative evening.
Thank you greatly. And thank you to everybody for your questions and for being here this evening.
Indeed. May you all have a blessed Holy Week and Easter coming up. And as you have ideas or thoughts on other topics you'd like to have speakers join us for, please reach out through the Presbytery website and let us know what's on your mind. And with that, peace of Christ be with you all, and God's mercies on your house. Good night, everyone.